Welcome to episode 293 of the Postal Hub podcast. I'm Ian Kerr. When is a contractor not a contractor? When they're an employee, of course. Well, there's not so much an of course about it anymore, at least not in Belgium, where there's new legislation in the wind targeting the delivery sector, in particular what you might call sham contracting or false employment, whatever you want to call it. So it's always interesting to see what's happening in a particular market and what that could mean for neighbouring countries, the rest of Europe, the rest of the world, who knows. So joining me in just a moment is Roel Gevaers, Professor in Last Mile Logistics and Supply Chain at the University of Antwerp. We're going to talk about this and a couple of other little bits and pieces. So coming up in just a moment, Roel Gevaers. Joining me on the line is Roel Gevaers. He's the Professor in Last Mile Logistics and Supply Chain at the University of Antwerp. Roel, welcome back. Where every time we have you on the podcast, it's a very different topic. And again, we've got this really interesting thing that's happening in Belgium at the moment with some proposed legislation that seems to be focusing on, well, you might call it sham contracting or false employment, whatever you want to call it. But basically, what would you say? It's a misclassification of contractors and all of that. Anyway, I'm rambling already. Can you give us a quick overview of what this proposed legislation is and what it's aimed at changing?
Well, around 2 years ago or 1 year and a half ago, in Belgium, there was in the news that some postal parcel business companies were not always, let's say, working fully in line with social security legislation. So at that moment, the Minister of Postal Services in Belgium, Petra de Sutter, decided we need to implement a new legislation which should take care of the subcontracting or the independent contractors in postal parcel businesses. And so now, 1 year and a half after when that news popped up in the media, she decided to launch a law proposition or a proposition to legislation to, let's say, where subcontractors in postal and parcel businesses should be better protected. So it's a bit the same discussion you sometimes hear in Deliveroo types of deliveries, the gig economy, but this legislation will only focus on postal parcel couriers. And she proposing a kind of legislation where the idea of sham contracting or false self-employment is put upside down a bit in postal parcel businesses. So it might mean a big change in postal parcel legislation in Belgium when it's really implemented.
Now, why are you saying postal and parcel carriers? Why is it limited to them and not, say, other delivery contractors? What's the story there?
Because as always, every government and politics is always a bit special in that way that every minister has its specific departments where it can take decisions. And in this case, postal parcel department, or it's part of the postal regulator, their Minister de Sutter can take herself decisions together with the government, of course, but that's one specific, well-described sector. I mean, we all know it depends a bit per country, but everything which is a shipment below 30 kilogram, which is in a box and with some extra descriptions, it's a well-described sector. And there she can take rather quick decisions if you want to implement new legislation which might be applicable for the whole transportation sector. Then you're even in a bigger European scale, then the options to implement new legislation are rather limited.
So in this legislation that's been proposed, it's not talking about truck drivers, in a semi-trailer. We're looking at basically vans. But you mentioned the gig economy earlier. Will gig economy riders be caught up in this, or are they going to be somehow separate to this proposed legislation?
So like the proposal is now is that it will be checked by, in Belgium we have the postal regulator, BIPT, which is the national postal regulator. It will be only the companies that are considered as, let's say, under the regulation of BIPT, which will need to take this legislation into account in the future if it is approved. So the Deliveroos of these worlds and crowdsourcing logistics, if they are not in parcel business, they are not involved.
Now, what do you think about this in terms of effectiveness? I mean, is it potentially an effective piece of legislation, or are there potentially issues with it? Because those of us who are outside of Belgium are watching things like this thinking, could this happen in our market? What would it mean for our delivery fleet? What would it mean for our costs, our relationships with contractors? What would it mean for contractors' willingness to become a contractor, et cetera, et cetera? So what are some of the details of this proposed legislation?
The details of the legislation are, the idea of the legislation is that every company that is considered as a parcel company needs to have a kind of a license, what you call. They need to put themselves on a kind registrants list at BIPT. And next to that, they will need to upload every month, week, that still needs to be decided. If I check the proposed legislation well, they need to send on a regular time basis the number of hours that subcontractors are working for them. So, for example, subcontractor A is working 50 hours a week and 90 hours per 2 weeks, etc. And there, BIPT should check if it's not too much, so that contractors are not working too many hours a week. And next to that, based on these hours, the contractor needs to be able to prove that he's paying the subcontractors a decent wage. So instead of having a drop per parcel calculation, which is a bit the standard today in the markets, they will need to prove that, for example, if a subcontractor worked 40 hours a week, that at least the subcontractor will get on a weekly basis, I'm just saying, for example, 320 euros, 40 hours multiplied by 8 euro, for example, as a kind of minimum wage. And that needs to be proven by these stamps and payment terms. But what would that mean? Well, I think it's a good method to make clear that the sector needs to think about how to make sure that you push out social excesses and misbehavior. The big disadvantage of this approach is that, in my opinion, it will create a huge amount of work for BIPT, in my opinion, because thousands and thousands of couriers will need to upload kind of data. First of all, who is going to check that? And secondly, I notice now in Belgium that in many cases, especially the control on social security in transportation sector is not always fully in line with what legislation is saying. What I mean is there is a legislation, but it's not always applied like it should be due to a lack of social inspectors in that sector. And that's a bit what the transportation sectors and even the unions are also saying, is that there is already a rather strict legislation that you should be in line with social security, but there is a difference between the legislation and really application in the market. It may be better first to check that first and implement it correctly instead of putting another scheme into practice where another party, being BIPT, needs to check all those things. And that will make it, in my opinion, very complex because in my opinion, BIPT can do checks, but on a regular basis, really checking if couriers are well paid. That's you don't see that those things happen in many postal regulators in Europe, to be honest.
I suppose everybody listening to this who manages a contracted network fleet, or even somebody who is a delivery contractor themselves, will know that not all contractors or subcontractors, whatever terminology you want to use, work in the same way. Some will have a van provided to them by their head contractor. Some will have to provide their own van. Some will have to cover all their own costs or part of their own costs. Some might even do work for multiple carriers. Exactly. So someone who might be in more of a rural area might be working for not just the post, but also another local carrier or a number of non-postal carriers. So how's that, all those sorts of variations, are they taken into account by this legislation?
Well, what you say is fully correct. In Belgium, we have very clear terminology, or rather clear terminology, what is considered as sham contracting or false self-employment. And it's a kind of a checklist. And if you, for example, if you're a subcontractor and you use the van of the contractor, or you use social security from the contractor, or you use the insurance of the contractor, in Belgium, it's considered almost by definition as false self-employment or sham contracting. With this new proposed legislation, it's upside down. So there, the new legislation says that the main contractor needs to take care for the subcontractors, for maybe the vans, being responsible for the insurances, being responsible for even the fuel, etc. But that will be only the case for the postal parcel sector, which means if you are a subcontractor and you work, for example, for some days as a subcontractor for a parcel company in the parcel business, and during some other days you are just doing, like, let's say, transportation of oversized goods or transportation of pallets, that sometimes happens. That means that depending which activity you are doing, you're under a totally different scheme of false self-employment, which is exactly the opposite of the other one. So if you're working on a Tuesday with parcels and you're driving with a fuel card of the postal company, that's fine. If you work on a Wednesday in the transportation business with the fuel card of your main contractor, that will be considered as false self-employment, which might, and then you're also not under BIPT, which, in my opinion, which makes it heavily complex. And in my opinion, it's the first time that I notice in years both the unions and the associations of transportation, they went together in one mail. So both of them signed that they said we are against this legislation, which is, in my opinion, the first time in years that the unions, let's call it more the left-wing ID parties and unions versus the transportation associations, they both went in one mailing, one letter to the minister, we don't agree with this new proposed legislation. And that's rather special, I think.
I guess one of the other questions has to be, what could this potentially mean for last mile delivery costs? Whilst you've just outlined how the regulator would have a significant administrative burden, I imagine the regulator is the regulator funded by industry?
The regulator is formally part of the federal government, so it's paid by taxpayers in one way or another. Yeah.
So then, with regard to the other administrative costs and compliance costs that the last mile operators will have, could we see an increased cost base and therefore an increase in costs for delivery in Belgium? And could that then open the door for operators in neighbouring countries to operate at a lower rate and then base themselves in, say, the Netherlands and then deliver into Belgium?
Well, first of all, will it increase prices and costs? As when I look to the Belgian postal parcel market, you already see that it's a market where most companies are really working at low costs and at low profit margins, which means that almost every decision you take to implement new legislation or implement new, whatever how you look to it, but it will increase administrative work. There will be an extra administrative burden, which by definition, if you are in a market where you're working at low cost, almost every decision you take will impact the costs in one way or another. So yes, prices will increase. I know that it sometimes said by government, it's not true. It will not increase. I can guarantee you there will be an increase, whatever. And I'm not saying it's bad. I'm totally not saying it's bad. Yeah, for the consumers it's bad, but for the sector it might not be bad. But yes, there will be a price increase, whatever decision you take, because now it's already at low cost. And indeed, there is a risk, of course, that people might become very flexible in let's say, using maybe fans from the other side of the border. Belgium is a bit e-commerce. If you look from e-commerce, that is ruled by the north part by the Netherlands and bol.com and the south part by Amazon.fr, which means as well that from a logistics point of view, that offer opportunities for them. Formally, the new legislation states that every party that is doing parcel deliveries in Belgium, also the companies from abroad, will need to register at BIPT. But how all those time stamps and all those time registered systems needs to be transferred if you are a company from abroad, that's a big question mark to me. So formally it's said that they also need to register, but in my opinion, I think there will be some attempts to try to cheat a bit with it if it's not a huge amount of parcels. But in every industry with new legislation, you will always see companies that try to take it on another direction. What might be also the effect is that, for example, today you sometimes have many discussions about false employment and sham contracting in some sectors. The opposite might also be true, that you are adjusted purely a standard transportation company and you ask for a permission to become a postal parcel player, and then you can offer, for example, to a lot of subcontractors own nice electric vans just to prevent that you're considered as a sham contractor. And that might be also the exactly the opposite, because now you sometimes have a lot of discussions. Is that party a sham contractor? Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. By making sure that you are in the postal business, you might do transportation activities under the stamp of postal parcel, but preventing that your subcontractors never can be considered as a sham contracting party.
My goodness. Roel, with the time we've got left, one last question. You mentioned at the outset that what triggered this was some investigative journalism that uncovered some unsavoury practices, shall we say, in the subcontracted delivery sector. Will this legislation, or whatever form it ultimately takes, will it protect those drivers from exploitation? Do you think it will achieve that aim?
I think it's, and I need to say, I like the fact that at least there is now a Belgian minister which is interested in the postal parcel sector, because, in most cases, 10 years ago, ministers and governments never were interested in postal and parcel and last mile businesses, but really have impacts. The problem is that there are so many parameters which you can cheat even in the new legislation, that I'm afraid that it might create a lot of administrative burden, and it might not always help or protect the couriers. In my opinion, there is already a clear description of social legislation in Belgium in transportation sector. Make sure that you implement that legislation very well, and that you do spot checks on that legislation, more than just now adding another complexity on top of it, which in my opinion will not always help the couriers of today.
Now, I can't let you go, Roel, without talking about one last thing. I know I said that was the last question, but one last topic, which is the decarbonising delivery project. This has got nothing to do with legislation, everybody. But Roel has been one of the people who's been helping get the project set up. Roel, just looking at the Belgian market right now, obviously we know about the BPost, EcoZone projects and things like that. Outside of BPost, is there anything happening with regard to electric delivery or with regard to low emission zones in cities or things like that will be interesting for people to know about?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look, I always describe Belgium a bit as a country which is always from, let's say, e-commerce, last mile parcel, sometimes a bit behind on the Netherlands or Germany, for example. But what you clearly see now is that there is a huge increase and interest in everything which is related to electrification and decarbonization of the last mile. For example, indeed, BPost is known for some of its EcoZone. But if you look to other companies, like you have companies like City Depot, which is heavily increasing their electrification in the fleets. You have companies also like GLS, etc., which is increasing the electrification, DHL as well. Local parties like urban parties like On Time, which are using more and more bicycle transportation. And I need to say, indeed, Belgian cities are more and more also considering, let's say, low emission zones or ultra low emission zones in the future. The timestamp is sometimes a bit unclear, but formally, Flanders, which is the north part of Belgium, for example, says that as from 2028, it's probably that you will not be able to do any more use combustion engines to do deliveries. And you even see that as well in even food delivery, which is not postal parcel, but even food delivery companies, which need electrified vans, of course, are also looking more and more to electrification of vans, and also the investments that are taking place in hydrogen solutions for trucks are also getting to be known. For example, Deleuze, one of the biggest supermarket chains, invested, for example, some weeks ago in an electric truck and already some years ago in a hydrogen truck to do testings with that. So yes, it's now fully up and running in Belgium. And I think your newsletter and the project for decarbonizing deliveries is a very good and arriving at a very good moment to help the sector, what is happening worldwide and in Europe on that topic.
Now, Roel, if people want to find out more about the work that you and the team are doing at the University of Antwerp, where should they go?
They can check the website of the University of Antwerp, where I have my personal page, and I also try to post some. If there are nice new things in the sector, I also do some LinkedIn postings there. So LinkedIn or personal website on the University of Antwerp, there people can find enough information about me, I think.
And I will include a link to Roel's LinkedIn profile on thepostalhub.com. It is worth following him on LinkedIn because he comes up with all kinds of interesting stuff that's happening around the place. Roel Gevaers, Professor in Last Mile Logistics and the Supply Chain at the University of Antwerp. Thank you very much for joining us on the Postal Hub podcast today.
With pleasure.
Coming soon on the Postal Hub podcast, Mendigas Serpikas from Copenhagen Economics to talk about some really interesting postal sector research. That's an interesting one. Keep an ear out for that. We've got Dean McCuber from Crossroads Parcel Consulting who's going to talk about Walmart, Target, and how these two retail behemoths dominate not just retail, but in a way, last mile and e-commerce in North America. Another interesting discussion. Stay tuned for that one. Luke Lloyd from the International Postal Corporation joins us to talk about cross-border e-shopper preferences and all kinds of really interesting stuff. And who else? Daniel Rueda from Open Price. He's going to be back. And someone else. Who else? Let's just keep it a secret between you and me. What else can I tell you? The usual stuff. You can follow me on LinkedIn. You can subscribe to the email newsletter if you haven't already. Make sure you subscribe to Decarbonising Delivery if you haven't already. And, if you want to email me, ian@thepostalhub.com is my email address. I'm Ian Kerr. Thanks for listening in. And I look forward to your company next time on the Postal Hub podcast.